On this week's episode of Inside Outside Innovation, Robyn and I sit down to talk about divergent thinking, peak college towns, and how as little as 250 documents can poison your AI. Let's get started. Inside Outside Innovation is the podcast to help innovation leaders navigate what's next. Each week, we'll give you a front row seat into what it takes to grow and thrive in a world of hyper uncertainty and accelerating change. Join me, Brian Ardinger, and Mile Zero's Robyn Bolton as we discuss the latest tools, tactics, and trends for creating innovations with impact. Let's get started. Welcome to another episode of Inside Outside Innovation. I'm your host, Brian Ardinger, and I have my co-host, Robyn Bolton. Hello, Robyn.
Hello, Brian. How are you today?
I am doing well. Episode 338. We're excited to talk about innovation. I'm so glad you're on the journey with me here.
Wow, 338. There should be a cake or streamers or something.
Well, as usual, we've got a number of different articles and things that have caught our attention over the last couple of days. So I figure we dive in. And the first article I wanted to talk about today was from my friend Audrey Crane. She works at Design Map, and she posted on the Design Map blog an article on divergent thinking. The article, I'll give it a little preface. So it was looking at how to generate better ideas. It looked at a lot of things. First of all, looked at the research and the fact that there's a famous study by George Land and Beth Jarman looking at how 5-year-olds were asked to come up with as many uses as possible for a paperclip. And nearly all of them, 98%, could generate 200 or more ideas. They continued to do this study and looked into adulthood. And by the time the participants became adults, only 2% of adults could actually do the same thing and generate 200 ideas about a paperclip. It's pretty crazy. And it points to the fact that while it's super important skill to have to be able to generate new ideas and think about different things, we are losing that ability as we get older.
It was surprising and sad. It reminded me of two things. So one is a book that came out a long time, over a decade ago now, The Innovator's DNA, where the authors looked at, across hundreds, thousands of successful both entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs, corporate innovators. And they found that the one thing that they had in common, or most had in common, was associative thinking, which is being able to put two very different ideas together to make something. And so divergent thinking actually reminded me a lot of the associative thinking, because your brain works in different ways. And the second thing is, I teach at Massachusetts College of Art and Design. And in talking to my actual art colleagues there, one of the things that they say that's very consistent with what we say in innovation is that your first idea, your first work, your first version is always the worst. They have different language around the idea of constraints and don't accept the first version. But that is a very common discipline within the art and design world, that it's just your first idea is going to be terrible, so you've got to push past it. And that was another aspect of this article that I found really interesting.
It fits into startups as well. I was mentoring the new batch of NMotion companies that are going to be announced here soon that are going through it, and did a little roundtable and met each of the teams and talked about what they're building in that. And the piece of advice I left them with is, you're here on day one with your idea. Be open to other ideas that happen when you start talking to customers and trying to understand if you really are onto something. Because I think a lot of times you get into Accelerator or you get some early traction and you think, okay, I've got all figured out. I got the solution. I'm just going to barge ahead. But you have to be open to that divergent thinking and different ways of doing things, just so you don't necessarily leave opportunity on the table.
It's the old adage, right? That fall in love with the problem, not the solution. And it's so easy to fall in love with the solution, but the divergent thinking article was a great reminder and data-based reminder of why we've got to nurture the skill to go beyond that.
Yeah, and I love the article too, because Audrey goes into a number of different techniques, brainstorming techniques and that. So I encourage people to check that out to learn some tactical things about how you go about building up that divergent thinking muscle. Well, the second article, this one made me a little nervous. It's from the Neuron Daily, which is a fantastic newsletter. And this one came out a couple weeks ago, but the title was Poisoning AI Models Just Got Scarier. 250 documents is all it takes. And it goes on to look at some research that came out of Anthropic that looked at The number of documents that you could ingest into the LLM that would make it start spewing out nonsense and making it bad. The original thinking was, well, the more larger models that you have, you'd have to have more malicious documents put into it to make it go off the rails. What they found out was that's actually not the case. It takes a very small amount of wrong data to be put into it to actually make it start going the wrong direction. Actually, I think in the article it talks about a 13 billion parameter model trained on 260 billion tokens got backdoored with the same 250 documents as a 600 million model trained on just 12 billion tokens. And previous research assumed that attackers needed to control 0.1 of the training data. And so for larger models, you need millions more documents. What actually happened is the math was 250 poison documents is only 0.00016 of the training data was enough to actually poison the model itself. Crazy stuff to think about it. When we think about all the things that we're putting into the web and everything else, it's a wonder why we're not seeing more and more hallucinations, I guess.
It was terrifying. And I'll be honest, the numbers went so over my head, but it had an analogy in there. It's like putting a teaspoon of a toxin into an Olympic-sized pool, and
Yes.
you'd kill all the swimmers. And I was like, oh, that is so much more awful than I thought when you were just saying 250 documents. And, I think it just goes to highlights there's incredible promise with Gen AI, and there's risks that we don't even know about. It's one of those things of use with caution.
It'll be interesting to see what other research comes out to either debunk this or to fill up the back holes of this. But it's just something to keep in mind and follow the research and see what's actually going on out there because we are in brand new territory and the exploration mode. We need to be wary of the pitfalls that are ahead as well.
250 documents. It's so little.
All right. The third article this week is from Kyla Scanlon. She's got a new book out focused on the economy. She's up and rising star in the space and become a Gen Z influencer in the economic space, if you can believe that. But Kyla has a piece called What Happens to College Towns After Peak 18-Year-Old. And the article goes on to talk about we think about like the Rust Belt and how the economy changed and all those towns were decimated once manufacturing left. What's happening in the new world when universities, for example, are leaving these smaller towns and can't keep up with the enrollment, and what happens when basically entire portions of the economy and portions of the United States have to rethink one of the core tenants or the core economic engines within their backyard.
This one hit real close to home. I grew up in Cleveland, part of the Rust Belt. My dad's from Western Pennsylvania. He literally grew up in a city called Oil City. So you can imagine what happened to that when the Rust Belt dried up. And, I went to school at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, which Oxford, Ohio exists because Miami is there. And there's nothing but cornfields around it. And so I saw the bulk of my life being reflected in this article. And the statistics she cites around college enrollment, around population ages and trends, it paints a really bleak picture that, I hadn't really considered before. She proposes some interesting solutions, but I just always think about Oxford, like if Miami went away, there's no reason for that town to exist. And you could turn the dorms into startup incubators. You can do all that stuff, but why is anyone going to be a solid hour and a half from Cincinnati in the middle of a cornfield?
And I think a lot of people underestimate the fact these small colleges, what they effectively are is talent engines for the
Mhm.
economy. And whether those folks don't always stay around, the fact that you have new people every year coming into the ecosystem and participating in economically and otherwise, it is a flywheel engine that if you start pulling away from that, and there's a lot of factors that are, causing this. If you look at the statistics of just the number of kids, I think this year was the peak, what's going to be the
Mhm.
peak of just people that are turning 18 and capable of going to college. That's falling. Enrollment across all institutions, I think, dropped 12% between 2010 and 2023. So that's 18 million students down to 15 million students. And this is happening around the backdrop also of, NIH research funding cuts. Many, many states are pulling back on the research dollars that they're putting into their universities. And so all these factors are effectively cutting off our nose just by our face as we're trying to compete and innovate into the new world, we're taking away all the resources of whatever that new economic engine is.
I have to put my jobs to be done plug in here because the article talks about she went back to her alma mater, Western Kentucky University. And what was striking to me in the article is that the majority, I forget the percentage, it was like 67% or something like that, of people who applied to attend Western Kentucky, the vast majority who didn't attend any school. And so it just the competition is completely different in and amongst everything else that universities are facing. So I just thought it was a really thought-provoking article that also was slightly terrifying in a number of ways, and also did not have a perfect solution because nothing has perfect and simple solutions these days.
Well, and I like bringing up these particular topics because it's not just all about business world and how can we improve the day-to-day tasks and make our teams better. I think it's important as an innovator to think about the larger economic things that are going on, the dangers that are out there, the opportunities that are out there, and being open to new sources of information so that you can start making different types of connections when you are innovating in various forms. All right, we'll try to make the next one a little bit more lighter. We had a bonus article this week in the newsletter talking from Entertainment Weekly, talking about the 31 best sci-fi movies of all time. So, what's your take?
So I was tracking pretty well with it. The top 5 are ones you'd expect, like 2001: A Space Odyssey and Close Encounters of a Third Kind. I was surprised. I think number 3 was Back to the Future,
Yes.
which I never even considered a sci-fi movie, but I was like, "Oh, yeah, I guess it would be." And it ages pretty well. And so I was tracking with it. And then we got down to, I think it was 23, and it was Starship Troopers. And I have never seen that movie. I've seen parts of it as I've walked through the living room, and it didn't strike me as a great movie. But in talking to my husband who watches sci-fi movies, he's like, "No, there's a cult following, people love it." But number 24, so behind Starship Troopers was The Empire Strikes Back.
I know. Yeah, how can
And
you not
I
have it in
just
the top, whatever.
at that point, the entire list was nullified, and I'm like, "No, no."
It was interesting. I'm sure it was 32 on the list. There's other ones out there that are probably should be on that list. Maybe they should make the next one a top 50 list. I would have to agree with the number one. I can understand 2001: Space Odyssey. The coming of Hal, and
Yeah.
it still is relevant today, even maybe more so relevant than before.
I know.
If I looked at the list and tried to pick my favorites out of it, I would have E.T. as one of the top ones on the list.
Yes.
From the standpoint of I was that age probably when E.T. came out,
Yep.
and I like going back and watching that particular movie because we could all use a little humanity. That the scary creature doesn't always have to be scary, and we don't have to send the army after it to to understand what's going on. And then the other one that piqued my memory, it was the Planet of the Apes. The idea of going into this multiverse, and you end up
Yeah.
in the same New York that you in the future, and it's not what you expected.
Really surprised that one wasn't higher. And I noticed there was not a single Star Trek movie on the list.
That's true as well.
And, I'm not a Trekkie, but I know Trekkies, and I think a lot of people would be like, The Wrath of Khan should have been somewhere in the top 31. I was surprised by that, but I'm with you on ET. I'm like, "Oh, that should have been higher."
The one that I think maybe gets on the list next year would be Her, primarily because it's playing out in real life. I don't know when it came out, 2008, but it seems to be fairly on point if you haven't seen that one.
And maybe moving to the documentary list.
All right, well, let's wrap up with some tactics to try. I was thinking a lot this week about some of the things that we have talked about in that, and one of the tactics that I always like to talk about is this idea of wandering the cave, and the idea that innovation is very much like going into a dark, scary cave where you've no idea what you're going to encounter. And your job is to pick the cave, that idea, that area of interest, and start fumbling forward. So I think a lot of people think that they can innovate and find the answer by thinking, but a lot of it requires you to go into the cave, requires you to fumble around, requires you to go out and explore and test and try things to figure out if it's the right path or not. The key to that is to take action and actually pick a cave and go for it. So that's my tactic to try. What's your cave you're going to pick this week to go after and learn something new or explore a little further?
Yep, and remember the falling in the mud and touching the slimy walls, it's part of it. The cave is messy. It's okay. You'll survive. So my action was actually inspired by one of the articles we talked about of try to come up with 200 uses for a paperclip. I have a paperclip sitting on my desk. I have a notebook next to me. And every time an idea comes in my head, I write it down for the paperclip. I've been doing this all week. I've just cracked 50. I don't know how long it's going to take me to get to 200.
You're about a 10-year-old level now.
Maybe, hopefully. But I'd also say, like, it's a fun activity to do as a family, especially if you have different age groups or, different friends with different perspectives. So look at the paperclip, come up with ideas.
We'll check back in on next episode to see how the list is going. Thanks for coming out for another episode of Inside Outside Innovation. We'll see you next time. That's it for another episode of Inside Outside Innovation. Today's episode was produced and engineered by Susan Stiebel. If you want to learn more about our teams, our content, our services, check out insideoutside.io. Or if you want to connect with Robyn Bolton, go to milezero.io. And until next time, go out and innovate.